Hey everyone, welcome to the module about film. This is a really important module because if you don't understand how film works and how you can manipulate it and all the different formats that it comes in, then it's really hard to choose a format that works for you. So for this course, we're just going to focus on these two film formats. There's so many more, but for the most part, many of my photographer friends and myself only use these two formats. And whenever you hear the term film format, it's truly just referring to the size of the film itself. So this is 35 millimeter, and this is what people typically shoot with. It's probably what you're most familiar with. And then there's 120, which is the larger, and this goes into medium format cameras. So we typically call this medium format film. So let's talk about what film is actually made out of so you can understand how you can manipulate it. As you can see here, this film is kind of like a plastic type material. And on one side it's lighter, and then on the other side you'll see this dark coating. So film is made out of this plastic material, and then the dark part here is a gel emulsion, and that's nothing super fancy. It just means that whatever chemicals, whatever materials they put into it, they put on this side, and what is inside of this that creates the magic is a material called silver halide crystals, and these crystals are actually photosensitive, meaning they're sensitive to light. And what happens is whenever light hits this part of the film, it creates a chemical reaction, and the more light that hits this emulsion, the more of that chemical reaction occurs. So the longer you leave your shutter open, the more light that hits it, the longer that chemical reaction occurs, and you create an image. So for example, if you put a lot of light onto a negative or a film, you're going to create a brighter image. Whereas if you don't let a lot of light on the film, it's going to create a darker image, right? So that's the chemistry behind it. And one of the things that people don't realize is that the higher the ISO of the film itself, the larger the size of those crystal halide crystals. And so if you like shots that are really grainy, you're typically going to want to shoot for ISO 800 film or ISO 3200. And we'll talk about that. But speaking of ISO itself, a lot of photographers don't realize when they first start that you really can't manipulate the ISO of film. It just comes as the ISO that it is. So for example, this 35 millimeter film is Portra 800 by Kodak, and that means that the ISO is 800 of this film. This one, this medium format film, is ISO 400. So when you're choosing film, it's really important to figure out what variety of film do you want, because we're shooting in different lighting scenarios. So you have to think about, okay, when I'm shooting at the beginning of the day, we're right next to a window, I'm getting a lot of natural light coming in. So it's okay if I shoot with a lower ISO film, like ISO 400. But if you're shooting indoors, you really need to consider paying for a higher ISO film, ISO 800 and 3200. The thing about 3200 though is it only comes in black and white. And part of this course, I do have a sheet for the different film stocks that I use in the different lighting situations. So really quickly, as an example of what I use ISO 200 film, and that's very low sensitivity to light. So if I use ISO 200 in a situation, I'm only using it outside, or I'm using it when we're indoors right next to a window. Other than that, I won't use ISO 200 film. When I'm shooting indoors and I know I can kind of push it and I can slow down my shutter a lot, I will use ISO 400, but more often than not, for indoor situations that do have a lot of light, I will always use ISO 800. I primarily shoot with Kodak because Fuji is being discontinued, unfortunately, which is super sad because I love Fuji. Well, at least Fuji medium format. So the thing about the ISO films is that when you are going into shooting a wedding or any lighting situation, you really do have to have kind of like an arsenal of different film stocks so that if you are shooting inside, you're like, oh shoot, I need to switch to my ISO 800 film. Typically, I use Kodak 200, Kodak 400, Kodak 800, and then I'll use Ilford black and white 3200. And those are the 4 film stocks that I use for like 99% of what I shoot. I will have a list of all the different locations that I personally buy film. I recommend subscribing to Film Supply Club. You pay for a membership, but you do get a discount overall if you end up buying a lot of film, which I do buy a ton of film. And speaking of buying a lot of film, always make sure that you put your film in the refrigerator. The chemistry of the actual film itself will degrade over time. It won't degrade a ton. Like I've used film from, I bought film off of eBay that was like 20 years old just to see what would happen. And it turned out really grainy and really warm, but it still worked. So don't panic if you forget to put your film in the fridge. But for the most part, I've cleared out a shelf in my refrigerator and I put all of my film in that shelf. And during peak wedding season, I actually take up part of a shelf, like an actual shelf in the fridge itself, and fill up boxes because lately there have been shortages of film. So whenever you can, try and stock up because it's hard to sometimes go to a camera store and buy film when you need it. So Film Supply Club is my favorite place, but Adorama, B&H Photo, there's a few places that I recommend. And the best thing that you can do is get on their email list. Anytime you go onto their website and you have a particular brand or ISO of film that you like, if it's sold out, there's a little button at the bottom of their website and it says, hey, notify me when this comes back in stock. And I do that for every single website that sells film. I will have them email me to notify me when they've got the film back in stock. And it goes out of stock really quickly. So you have to make sure that you're checking your email every day, and then buy as much as you can when it does come in stock. So that is my recommendation because a lot of the time when people go into film photography, they don't realize these things about the market until it happens to you. And then you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? There have been so many photographers that I've talked to that they're panicking because they can't find any of the film that they need for their upcoming wedding. So that's something to really consider when you get to that point and you're shooting a lot of film. You really need to kind of not hoard it, but buy as much as you can and fill your refrigerator up for the wedding season. So that's my little soapbox moment for film itself. The other things that you need to know about film is that you never want to underexpose film. You can't recover underexposed film. It's totally different than when you shoot on a DSLR, for example. If you underexpose, you're totally fine. But with a DSLR, if you overexpose, you can't recover that. It's actually the exact opposite with film. You want to overexpose just to be safe, because if you underexpose, you will never be able to recover that. There's no way to do it, especially after they go through and they develop the film itself. So we will talk about how to ensure that you're always properly exposing, but that's something that I want to make super clear, is that you really need to overexpose your film. You can overexpose your film up to 6 stops and it still looks great. It's really hard to overexpose film, but it's really easy to accidentally underexpose film. And when you do that, like, there really is no recovery for that. And I don't want you to make that mistake. I've had people message me saying, hey, what can I do about this? And there really is no fix for underexposed film. But the great part about film is that it is very flexible in terms of overexposure. So you're typically okay if you overexpose 1, 2, or 3 stops. It doesn't really impact the overall look. It's not noticeable at all. And I've compared shots where I've shot the same thing over and over again, but I've just slowed down my shutter speed 1 or 2 stops, and then did the next shot where I slowed it down even further and let in more light, and the shots looked great. So those are the most critical things that you really need to know about film, like the rules around film, is that film is super flexible. Don't be afraid of it. But it's better to overexpose than under. And the other thing that people ask me about film is when they put it into their cameras, if they're able to switch film out. And the difficult part about that is that you really need to go into the day or into whatever lighting situation you're in with the expectation that you finish the roll. Unless you're really good about remembering what number you're on, the only way that you can really switch film out of a film camera is if you have like a medium format camera where you can actually take the film back off and then put a second film back on that has different film in it. Then that's really easy, but you've got to make sure you have a sticky note or something on the back saying like, oh, black and white. And then when you take this off, and you have your other film back that you put on filled with color film, make sure there's a sticky note on that, because it's really easy to forget. And you can do it, but medium formats are the only cameras where you can really do that easily and quickly. If you do it with a 35 millimeter camera, like this one, you can't, right? Because if you open the film back, then you're screwed, basically. You have to rewind the film and remember, oh, okay, I'm on shot 25. And when I rewind the film, I have to remember when I put the film back in to cover my lens, put it face down, and click through 25 times to get to the part of your roll that hasn't been exposed. And that's really painful. But if you really do want to do that, it is possible. You just have to make sure you find the rewind button on your camera. And on my camera, I'm using the Canon 1V as my example here. It's different for different cameras, but on my camera in particular, this is all automatic. I can press this rewind button and it will rewind the roll even if I'm halfway through. And I just have to make a note either on a sticky note and put it on the back of my camera or on that roll, what part of the film or what shot I was on that roll. And then I can put another roll in. When I'm ready to shoot that roll again, I have to be really careful and pull out the leader part of the film, which is this little guy, because if you rewind too much, this goes all the way into the canister. So unless you know how to pull that leader back out or rewind manually, sometimes you'll accidentally pull the film all the way back into the canister. So just be aware of that for rewinding. Still totally possible. So when you're done and you've rewound it, you take your film out, put your sticky note on it saying I'm on shot 25, and then take your other film that you want to shoot, put it in your camera, and then you can start shooting it. When you're done with that roll, pull it out, take this roll and put it back in, And what you're gonna have to do is you're gonna have to cover your lens so no light gets in, and you're gonna have to shoot till you get to that shot where your last shot was, and then you can continue where you left off. I know that sounds like a pain in the butt, which is why I typically don't do that, because I always forget like what number am I on or what shot am I on. And I just don't take the time, honestly, especially on a wedding day. So what I do is I try to just shoot through the entire roll. And if I need to shoot a different kind of film, like if I'm going inside, outside, then I'll just have another camera on me with a higher ISO film or a lower ISO film. So I don't have to like take a roll out and put a new roll in. It's just a headache. You don't want to have to deal with that. It's similar to like when you're shooting a wedding day and you have two cameras on, one with one kind of lens and one with another lens, because you don't want to have to keep switching back and forth. Same thing with film cameras and different ISO film. If you know you're going to be going back and forth, then sure, have two different cameras with two different ISO films. But for me in particular, I don't like making it overly complicated. So I'll just make sure I know what kind of film I need for each part of the day. And usually I start indoors with getting ready. So I shoot with a higher ISO film. And once I'm done and I know I'm about to go outside, then I'll switch to another film as long as that roll is done. Otherwise, I just keep shooting with that roll and adjust my shutter speed. So I know I get a lot of questions about that. Like, can I switch film out? Typically, I err on the side of not doing that, just because the wedding day goes so fast that sometimes you just don't have time for doing that. So getting another film camera with a different ISO film to put in it, if you do prefer that, is helpful. But for me, I don't do that just because the day goes fast. I like to go into the wedding day with a plan of what ISO film I'm going to use in different situations and just start with that, shoot through the roll, and then I'll take it out and then put in a different roll. So those are the main rules in terms of film itself. In later modules, we will talk about how to manipulate film, do really cool effects, shoot film as if it were a different ISO. There's so many different things that you can do to manipulate film to get different effects and have it work for you in different lighting situations. But just for now, these are the main things that you really should know about film and have solid and in the back of your head to, get you ready to go to the more complex stuff. But thanks so much for watching, and I hope this was helpful for you. I'll see you in the next module.